Good afternoon, everyone. We will just wait for a minute or so to allow people to sign on. Good afternoon. Let's get started. Welcome to this webinar. This is now the second webinar this year, hosted by the Cardiovascular Research Institute here at Mount Sinai. I would like to thank the organizers from development, Todd Brooks, Cassie Camargue, Jackie Mark, and Jackie Smith for organizing this. The title of this webinar is Getting to the Heart of Comorbidities, How Additional Diseases Affect the Cardiovascular System. And as I said, this is the second one this year. In May, we had our first webinar that focused on the involvement of genetics and lifestyle factors to cardiovascular disease. And here we will be talking about comorbidities. My name is Filip Swirski, and I am the Arthur and Janet C. Ross Professor of Cardiology Medicine at the Cardiovascular Research Institute. I'm also Director of the Cardiovascular Research Institute. Joining me for this seminar are Leigh Goedeke, who is an Assistant Professor of Medicine and Cardiology, and Assistant Professor of Endocrinology, Diabetes, and Bone Diseases, as well as Samita Sahoo, who is an Associate Professor of Medicine and Cardiology, also at the Cardiovascular Research Institute here at Sinai. And what I would like to do today is first to say, what is the purpose of these webinars? Why are we holding them? And so what I would like to say is that really there's several reasons why we hold them. First is to share with you what discoveries are being made in cardiovascular science. It's important to sort of realize that science really matters. We are not here to talk about clinical care, but rather tell you stories that sort of happen in labs where actual discoveries are being made, discoveries that can change and do change healthcare, that can lead to new treatments and new ways of addressing cardiovascular disease. We are also holding these webinars to really highlight the work of investigators at the Cardiovascular Research Institute who are making those discoveries. So really share with you in a very personal way the kind of science that is being done, that is emerging at the Institute, that is going to make those major changes and is going to help find treatments and cures for cardiovascular disease. And the third reason is to really talk about topics that are of general interests, of importance and interest to the public, to really recognize that science and discovery is essential to healthcare. And so what I would like to do is really tell you a little bit about the topic of today. Why should we be caring about comorbidities? And what does it mean, comorbidities? How should we be thinking about comorbidities as they pertain to cardiovascular health? And then I will ask our co-panelists, Leigh and Samita, to give you specific examples of the work that they are doing in their lab that really illustrates this theme. I will end with specific projects in my lab that also illustrate this theme, and then we will open up this webinar to questions. And so I invite all of you to use the Q&A button to ask questions. We will try to get through as many questions as possible. We have 40 minutes or so left, and so let's begin. So again, the topic is getting to the heart of comorbidities, how additional diseases affect the cardiovascular system. So I would like to start by just saying that what we know for sure is that as we age, we accrue diseases. In other words, we have more and more diseases that afflict us the older we get. And so as we think about, how that ensues, there are ways that we can think about, well, maybe some of the diseases that we have nothing to do with each other. For example, you can think of, chronic back pain won't impact asthma or depression, for example. So you can imagine diseases that are sort of parallel to one another, but they're not influencing each other. One can think of diseases that may actually work against each other. A famous example of this is sickle cell anemia, which actually protects from malaria. But what we're finding and what we're learning is that many diseases are linked. And this is indeed the purpose of today's conversation. And we want to sort of talk about how diseases are linked, really focusing on cardiovascular diseases and begin to understand what is it about certain diseases that links them. And there's abundant evidence about how cardiovascular diseases are linked with other diseases. A notable example, for example, is cancer and cardiovascular disease. This is an ongoing or emerging field of cardio-oncology. We have evidence in the literature that cardiovascular disease associates with inflammatory bowel disease. So there's sort of a risk factor for developing cardiovascular disease if you have inflammatory bowel disease. We know that there's associations between neurodegenerative diseases, such as Alzheimer's, and cardiovascular disease. And of course, the classic risk factors for cardiovascular disease, such as obesity, diabetes, and hypertension, are also relevant. And we understand a lot of the epidemiology here. We understand there's plenty, abundant evidence in the clinical literature telling us that these diseases are linked. The question is, how are these diseases linked? And we have clues. We know that the immune system and inflammation may be a key connector of comorbidities. The metabolic system, likewise, may connect diseases. The circulatory vascular system, there's evidence for the hematopoietic system. So this is the system that produces our red blood cells and our white blood cells that fight infection and injury. And even very recently, we have come to recognize that the nervous system and even the endocrine system may be a key connector of diseases. And this is really the work of scientists in labs who are trying to understand at a deep level, at a cellular, molecular level, how these diseases are connected. And the next question is, why is this important? Why should we bother to understand how these diseases are connected? And this is really something that we would like to talk about as we share with you some of our personal, or I should say, some of the work that is being done at the Cardiovascular Research Institute to understand, why this is important. And I hope we really get to this, and at the end of this hour, you will really appreciate and understand, why it is that we should be investigating those biological mechanisms that tie diseases together and that then result in this accrual of diseases as we age. So I would like to first ask Leigh Goedeke to tell you about her project and really give you an example of comorbidities that influence cardiovascular disease. Leigh.
Thanks, Phil. So my lab is really interested in understanding how dysregulated metabolism really contributes to a lot of these chronic diseases that Phil was mentioning earlier, particularly diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So first, let me take a step back and just orient everyone. So when I refer to metabolism, I'm talking about the sum of all life-sustaining chemical reactions that occur within the cells of our body. And so metabolic pathways are responsible for the conversion of nutrients that we get from our diet. So for example, carbohydrates, proteins, and fat. And it's responsible for converting these nutrients into a wide variety of metabolites that then our cells can use to construct new molecules, or our cells can actually break these down for the generation of energy in specialized organelles within our cells called mitochondria. And so this regulation of metabolism and energy flow is highly complex, and it's tightly regulated at the cellular and whole body level to keep us healthy. And so improper regulation of metabolism, what my lab's interested in studying, is a common feature of many chronic diseases. And one of the most common metabolic disorders is diabetes. And diabetes occurs when the body cannot produce enough insulin, and this occurs within type 1 diabetes, and this leads to improper processing of sugar. It can also occur when our cells can't respond to insulin, and this happens in type 2 diabetes. And this inability of our cells to respond to insulin is known as insulin resistance, and if left untreated, can lead to high blood sugar or glucose levels, which over time can cause health issues. And actually 30 million people in the United States have type 2 diabetes, many of whom are unaware or not yet diagnosed. And so this is really a key area of interest to my lab and others at the CVRI, because individuals with type 2 diabetes are actually 2 to 3 times more likely to develop cardiovascular disease, such as heart attack, heart failure, and stroke. And so again, this link between diabetes and cardiovascular disease is complex and something that we're really interested in understanding. And we think that part of this association may be related to the cardiometabolic risk factors that coexist in patients with type 2 diabetes. So for instance, high blood pressure, elevated levels of cholesterol in our bloodstream, insulin resistance, high blood glucose levels, or low-grade inflammation. In addition, we and others have recently uncovered metabolic changes that happen within the heart and the vasculature, which can also contribute to worsening of cardiovascular disease risk. And so again, my lab's interested in understanding these mechanisms that may be occurring in various tissues, particularly the liver and also the heart, that can increase cardiovascular disease risk, and how we can leverage these learnings to develop new treatments for both diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So just one example of a project we're working on is whether we can treat cardiovascular disease in patients with diabetes through an oral compound called a controlled metabolic accelerator. And so this class of compounds actually mimics a natural process that occurs within all of our cells called mitochondrial uncoupling. And when we give this compound to animal models of obesity, we find that it results in fat-specific weight loss and also improvements in glycemic control and insulin resistance. And more excitingly, what we recently found was that if you give this controlled metabolic accelerator, in addition to improving type 2 diabetes, it's also able to reduce cardiovascular disease in mouse models of obesity. And so current work in the lab is really exploring the fundamental mechanisms by which these controlled metabolic accelerators work in order that we may develop new treatment options to reduce cardiovascular disease risk in patients with diabetes.
Thank you, Leigh. So what you heard here is diabetes being a comorbidity for cardiovascular disease. And one of the things I mentioned earlier is the question is what is connecting this? And here from Leigh, one key system is really metabolism that is connecting these comorbidities. So now let's turn to Samita Sahoo and hear about her work in her lab that speaks to the theme of this webinar. Samita.
Thanks, Dr. Swirski, and thank you, Dr. Goedeke, for that introduction to type 2 diabetes. My lab studies heart failure in 2 different diseases. So here I'm going to share with you what we do in our lab. We study patients with type 1 diabetes and in patients with advanced kidney disease who are on dialysis. And these patients, it has been shown that they develop 2 to 3x more chance of heart failure and also die from heart failure. Individuals with type 1 diabetes develop heart failure at a much higher rate than people without diabetes. And many patients with kidney failure die from heart failure, but not from kidney disease. And doctors who treat these patients, they do not know why and how this happens. And therefore, there is no therapy to treat these patients specifically early on when the heart is starting to worsen because of the kidney disease or the type 1 diabetes. Now, I'll share a little bit on what we do in the lab to understand the reasons how a disease in the kidney or type 1 diabetes result in heart failure. We teamed up with doctors who treat patients with CKD, nephrologists, and endocrinologists to treat patients with type 1 diabetes. In my lab, in collaboration, we have recruited hundreds of patients to collect the blood samples from these patients. The blood of these patients carry molecules which will help us identify the reason these patients develop heart failure. Then we compare the blood from these diseased patients and with the healthy people who do not have these diseases and study their effects on heart cells in a dish in the laboratory. To explain a little bit more in details, there are very tiny particles in the nanometer size called extracellular vesicles or EVs. Those are found in the blood, everyone's blood. These EVs work like couriers, carrying damaging molecules from kidney, transporting them to the heart, and specifically studying these little couriers that carry these damaging molecules can help us understand about the heart failure in these patients. And we use sophisticated sequencing methodologies to identify precisely very small molecules that are present inside these little couriers called microRNAs. And these are the same RNA species for which the Nobel Prize in Medicine was given out this year, which are abundantly present in the blood. We perform some sophisticated analysis on these microRNAs to identify the ones that specifically damage the heart cells in a culture dish or when injected to mouse hearts. Identifying these microRNAs will help scientists design the diagnostic kits that can detect heart failure in these patients much before the patient themselves experience the symptoms or much before the cardiologist actually can detect in the hospital. It also helps us design novel therapeutics that we will treat the heart specific to the disease that the patient has. And we would be happy to discuss more in detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Susmita. So now let me tell you about a project in our lab that is really part of today's theme. And this is a project that is looking at how infection, and specifically viral infection, and specifically influenza, damages the heart and accelerates cardiovascular disease. So we've known for a long time that influenza really elevates risk for cardiovascular disease. The risk of having a heart attack when you have the flu can be 6-fold to 10-fold higher than if you don't have the flu. There is a tremendous increase in the risk of heart failure when you have influenza. And certainly vaccines mitigate that risk, but vaccines are not always effective. And the most vulnerable among us to influenza are the very young and the elderly, where the vaccines may not be as efficacious. And so there is really a mountain of evidence in the clinical literature that influenza is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and not only heart failure or myocardial infarction, but also arrhythmia, for example. And the question is, how does this happen? What leads to this risk? Again, how are these comorbidities, how are these morbidities connected? And this is really the work that we are doing in a project in the lab here at CVRI. And I'll just tell you a little bit about what we have discovered and what it is that we are still attempting to understand. So what we've looked at is we looked at autopsies from patients who died of influenza here at Mount Sinai. And what we find in these autopsies is that by and large, individuals who succumbed to influenza had abundant evidence of cardiovascular disease. It had atherosclerosis or evidence of heart failure or evidence of some heart damage. We also looked for evidence of heart damage in hospitalized patients, patients who are hospitalized with influenza. And again, we see that in more than 50% of those patients, we see evidence of heart damage. So there's this connection, but we don't really understand what it is. And one can think, well, that connection is probably inflammation. It might just be that influenza, which elicits a lot of inflammation, will elicit collateral damage and harm the heart. And that really is a hypothesis that we sought to answer. But we find that in reality, things are a little bit more complicated than this. What we find is that the virus really exploits specific cells in the immune system and specifically exploits these circulating, that is to say, cells that travel in the blood, circulating immune cells, infects those immune cells. And those immune cells essentially act as Trojan horses. They like to go to the heart. And when they accumulate in the heart, through processes that we are seeking to understand, they offload the virus, or another way of saying this, the virus escapes. The virus replicates in those cells, escapes those cells, and the virus really likes to infect cardiomyocytes. Now, cardiomyocytes are the muscle cells of the heart. These are the cells that contract. These are the key cells that really provide the heart with its function. And when influenza replicates in those cardiomyocytes, it damages them, which causes overall heart damage and problems that we see, including myocarditis. And so the question then is, what do we do about it? What do we do about people who may have severe influenza and myocarditis? How can we help these patients? And here is the question is, should we be trying to limit the virus with antivirals, or should we be looking at the response to the virus? And what we find, just to cut to the chase, is that it is the immune system's response to the virus that is damaging the heart. And now we're finding ways to allow the components of the immune system that limit viral spread to continue doing that in the lung while protecting the cardiomyocytes from the damage. So this is just one of the projects that really help us understand how influenza can elevate risk for cardiovascular disease, and how we can potentially come up with solutions and help individuals who develop myocarditis in response to influenza, and thus keep them healthier and prevent that risk. So this is 3 examples you've heard. And so now what I would like to do is open up the panel to questions. And hopefully we will have a discussion to really better understand how all of these things are connected. So what I'll start with is a question that for Leigh. The question is, you said that in type 2 diabetes, our cells don't normally respond to insulin. How does this happen? Leigh.
Sure. So you can think of insulin as like a key that opens up the channels on the outside of our cells, which allows glucose to enter. And so when our cells become resistant to insulin, these channels don't open properly and glucose cannot get in. And so there's several genetic and lifestyle factors that can contribute to insulin resistance. And at the cellular level, what we're actually finding is this may occur when certain fat molecules in our liver cells and muscle cells accumulate. And this interferes with the signaling process within a cell and the ability of insulin to kind of unlock these channels. And so because we're finding that these certain fat molecules can interfere with insulin signaling, we and others at the CVRI are interested in exploring how we can reduce this fat buildup. And one of the ways is by increasing the ability of our mitochondria to burn more fat. So this could perhaps happen by different diet regimens and also by the controlled metabolic accelerator that I told you about earlier in this webinar. And we're working on how we can use this to improve insulin resistance. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, Leigh. So a question to Samita. So why do we need to discover kidney or type 1 diabetes specific risk factors and therapeutics to treat heart failure in these patients? Like, for example, can we not treat these heart failure patients with common medicines such as statins or Ozempic or glucose co-transporter inhibitors?
Yes, so that's a good question. And statins, for example, they reduce the amount of specific cholesterol in the blood. And the other therapeutic modalities that are available, such as SGLT2 inhibitors, which are a class of drugs that help lower the blood sugar in adults with type 2 diabetes. And these inhibitors, for example, also we have Ozempic, which helps with weight loss. And all of these drugs that have been shown to reduce cardiovascular events to a certain extent. And for example, these specific inhibitors for patients with type 2 diabetes is SGLT2 inhibitor. That works for patients with type 2 diabetes. We do not know, scientists or physicians do not know if those kind of drugs could specifically help with patients who have type 1 diabetes. And, heart failure happens for different reasons. The primary cause could be weight gain, blood sugar level, or blood pressure. And we need different and specific drugs to treat each type. The type 1 disease that we study, physicians do not know if these other treatments will work well in these patients. Moreover, mechanisms that induce type 1 mediated heart failure could be different than just specific weight loss or some cholesterol related issues. So our study will specifically identify diagnostics and novel treatment modalities to treat specifically patients with type 1 diabetes or kidney disease. And these might be very different than the drugs that is already existing in the market, which work on a generic basis. So what we are trying to help develop here is something closer to precision medicine, but a larger group of patients who have type 1 diabetes or kidney disease.
That's right. And, that's an important thing that you say here is because, we have to thread that needle. On the one hand, what we find is that drugs like, for example, Ozempic have these pleiotropic effects. So pleiotropic means that they have broader effects. They may, for example, reduce inflammation, but also reduce blood sugar and so on and so forth. But sometimes those pleiotropic effects can also be effects that do some harm. So that you have sort of a drug that has so many effects that it has side effects, right? And so this is where precision medicine comes in, right? So Samita, is that by looking at, by understanding specific mechanisms, by understanding how these morbidities are connected at the molecular scale, we can really tailor medicines to those molecular conversations, if you will, and thus limit side effects.
Yeah, precisely. Thank you.
All right. So let's keep going, and please, I see questions are coming in, so we will again try to answer as many of them as possible. Maybe I'll field one question that I received. Which is a really nice question. So, I spoke about how, viral infections can damage the heart. This was, as I shared the project that we are working on. But there might be a crosstalk. And so the question is, is the reverse true? So does cardiovascular disease confer greater risk on viral infection? And if so, how? And so, what I mentioned at the beginning, when we look at these patients at autopsy, most of them who succumbed to influenza had some indication of damage to the heart. And of course, the question is, well, did that damage arise after infection, or did they have a condition beforehand? And I think it's fair to say that in many cases, they already had atherosclerosis before they contracted influenza, and perhaps they would have survived the infection had they not had these morbidities. And so then, how would the cardiovascular disease confer greatest risk of the response to viral infection, or even risk of a viral infection? And so, one way that we should be thinking about this is that cardiovascular disease really does affect our immune system. There is heightened inflammation. We know that, for example, atherosclerosis, which is this chronic lipid-driven disease, is also a disease that heightens inflammation. And as we look at inflammation, of course, a viral infection induces inflammation, and if one already has underlying cardiovascular disease with a higher set point of inflammation, then the infection itself might really elevate that inflammatory burst, if you will, leading to really very damaging inflammation that occurs. So really, there is this crosstalk. And inflammation is just one of the possible ways by which these morbidities influence one another. Another could be, of course, for example, lipids. People who have elevated cholesterol, which also affects our immune systems, may respond more vigorously or unproductively to a viral infection, and thus really have these patients experience more severe influenza morbidity. All right, so let me ask another question. This one to Leigh. You spoke about how metabolic alterations in other tissues beside the heart, such as the liver, can lead to insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease. So how does dysregulated liver metabolism lead to insulin resistance and heart disease? So are these processes related? I guess that's sort of the question here.
Yeah, thanks. So I think this brings up a great point. When we're talking about how comorbidities can affect cardiovascular disease, we also have to think that cardiovascular disease can be affected by multiple systemic processes and tissues and that communicate with each other. And it's not just related to the heart. And so that's a lot of this inner organ crosstalk is a lot about what we think about at the CVRI. And so in particular, work that we're doing in the lab has been looking at how dysregulated metabolism that occurs within the liver can lead to risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And so I mentioned earlier a little bit about how fat can build up within the liver and how this can lead to processes that increase risk factors for cardiovascular disease, in addition to insulin resistance. So for instance, if mitochondria become dysfunction in the liver, we know that this can lead to increased glucose production, and this would increase blood sugar levels that we know is also an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. We and others have also looked at how insulin resistance in the liver may lead to actually overproduction of lipid molecules in the circulation, which then would also lead to increased cardiovascular disease, particularly atherosclerosis. And actually, if I can speak a little bit about more recent work in our lab has also found that dysregulated mitochondrial function in the liver can also lead up to the buildup of these harmful signaling metabolites, which we're just starting to characterize now. And we're finding that these metabolites not only cause insulin resistance locally within the liver and inflammation, but that they're able to travel within the blood to other organs such as the heart and increase damage there and inflammation. And so we're actually currently working with other scientists within Sinai to measure the levels of this circulating metabolite in patients with other cardiometabolic disease, such as diabetes, to see if this can predict increased cardiovascular risk. And then we're using genetic models of obesity and disease and knockout models in order to see how this metabolite may causally lead to insulin resistance and affect processes such as inflammation that would lead to increased cardiovascular disease risk. So I think an important point to remember is that a lot of these factors are related, and different organs communicate with each other in order to keep us healthy.
Right, that's right, Leigh. And I guess one theme that perhaps is emerging is that the immune system and inflammation is a very important connector of diseases, and the other one is sort of the metabolic system. And it's sort of interesting to think, what do these systems actually do, right? One can think about sort of, the immune system is our body's defense, right? And our metabolic system is the system that provides the energy, right, to defend, and actually it provides the energy for all of these processes. And so there is this amazing relationship between metabolism and the immune system in terms of what a system does what. You mentioned early metabolites in your sort of answer. Maybe can you just tell us a little bit more, what is a metabolite? Like what are these things?
Sure. So when I mention metabolites, so we think of kind of the macromolecules that we get from our diet. So if you imagine you're eating a meal rich in carbohydrates or sugar or protein, and so these molecules can then get broken down into smaller what we call metabolites. So for instance, this maybe different amino acids, so kind of the building blocks of these nutrients that we can then get from our diet. And so we're finding that some of these metabolites are beneficial and used to build up larger molecules that we can use to fuel the processes within our cells and body and keep us healthy, but that some of these metabolites may be waste products, so something that would be excreted. They can also have signaling properties that we're finding that can control the way that our cell either breaks down future molecules that we may ingest or synthesizes other molecules to fuel processes within our cells.
All right, thanks, Leigh. So now another question for Samita, and this is a question that really touches on some of those other factors that I mentioned at the beginning. In my introduction, I said that we're finding that cancer and cardiovascular disease is linked, and this is perhaps a topic for an upcoming webinar, or neurodegenerative diseases. But we also know about some of these classic risk factors, right? And I think that's where this question is coming to. So, you spoke about kidney and pancreatic malfunction. And so in addition to those, how do other factors such as obesity or high blood pressure or blood sugar affect heart failure? And, are these factors related?
Yes, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. So all these factors could be related, and these are very disease specific. For example, obesity, where the fat content of fat is higher in the body. The fat cells secrete molecules similar to what we are studying, these microRNAs, but they can be different type of microRNAs that reaches the heart and then directly can affect the cardiac cells. High blood pressure, which is a very generic condition. So in many kidney disease patients, there is high blood pressure, and this high blood pressure can directly affect the heart function. As we know, heart pumps the blood out. When the pressure is higher, this puts additional stress on the cardiac cells, and the cardiomyocytes, which are very fascinating long cells. They grow in size, they grow in length in some cases, they grow in width in some cases, and that's a way to adapt to this stressful environment that they are encountering, and thereby their functional output, which is the volume of blood they can send out to the rest of the body, changes. And also we discussed diabetes. There is high blood sugar in both type 1 and type 2 diabetes in different contexts and different reasons. And this high sugar can directly affect the cardiac cells, the cardiomyocyte, and that's what my lab is studying now. If we treat cardiomyocyte with high sugar, then what happens to their function? Do they contract and relax the same way they do, or they change their contraction, relaxation patterns, and they change how they respond and all those things? So that's why we need to study all of these different factors. They they could be related in a context of a disease. And many of the patients carry multiple parameters. For example, a patient who is obese may have high blood sugar or may have, hypertension, high blood pressure. And therefore, we study in the context of the disease, even though they are all related, we need to study disease-specific mechanisms because the molecular effect on cardiomyocytes specifically could be different. And the cardiomyocyte, how they respond to the particular context of either hypertension or high sugar could be different. Therefore, we need to really study individual patient groups to identify what exactly is happening in the patients, so we can develop diagnostic and therapeutics based on those.
Thank you, Susmita. So I have I'm just looking at a question, actually two questions that I can perhaps answer in one, sort of as part of one answer. So one of the questions is, how do you limit those immune cells, which you say love to go to the heart, from moving from the lungs to the heart? So I like that question. I'm happy to answer it. And I'm in the second question. So this is a question to me. How do we know if the flu causes the heart issues, or whether bad diet habits already cause the heart issues so that the flu then causes further damage, and so it's not the cause of? So, and these are, I think, related questions that I'd be happy to answer. So, first, I mentioned that the heart, that these circulating cells really like to go to the heart, and we are trying to understand why they like to the heart. We actually think the reason that they're going to the heart so abundantly is because the heart is an organ that has very high metabolic activity. It has to pump all the time, and it creates waste product as part of that metabolic activity. And so these immune cells that are circulating through the blood preferentially or abundantly accumulate in the heart, and it's part of their normal function to really take care. They're sort of like garbage collectors. That's one way of thinking about them. They remove waste products. And we know that from work of us and others, that this is what one of their functions in the body is to remove waste products. So they necessarily have to go to this very active organ to remove waste products. And it's the influenza virus exploits this. And by infecting those cells in the lung, because these cells migrate through the blood and through different organs, exploits this feature and as a result accumulates in the heart. And so the question is, well, can we limit this? And the answer is we can. Experimentally, what we can do is we can prevent those immune cells from going into the heart, because immune cells migrate to tissue according to these molecules called chemokines, or these chemoattractants, so kind of little addresses or that bring immune cells into any particular tissue. And if we inhibit a specific chemokine that is responsible for the migration of these immune cells into the heart, we actually can prevent a viral replication in the heart. But there is a cost to this, because these immune cells that are being exploited by influenza are also important for all the things that I said, for removing waste products. They're important for healing wounds and for dealing with infection. So it's not a good strategy to just prevent them from going to any tissue. What we need is a more surgical approach. And this is what we are working on, is to still allow them to migrate into tissues. But, and again, you've heard the word precision medicine, very precisely limit the damage in the heart while allowing those immune cells to still do what it is that they need to do in combating viral infection in the lung. And then the other question is, do bad diet habits already cause the heart problems? And the answer is yes. But we also know that in the healthiest of hearts, there is accumulation of these cells. was lifestyle factors such as bad diet habits or stressors, psychological stress or lack of sleep. What they do is they just raise the temperature, if you will. They make it easier for those cells to accumulate. They make it easier for the virus to enter the heart and replicate. And this is, again, the theme here is that one major system that connects these morbidities is the immune system, and the other one is the metabolic system, as you've heard both from Samita and Leigh. There is another question, and this one is for Samita, and it's about steroids. So the question is, do you recommend steroids to be used to control inflammation if you have type 2 diabetes? So tell us about steroids, and I think we have sort of other questions broadly about various types of drugs. So maybe we can start with steroids.
Yes, thank you, Phil. Steroids, as we know, these are certain class of chemicals that help reduce inflammation in the body. They can ease symptoms from inflammatory conditions such as arthritis, skin rashes, and many, asthma and all those diseases that we know of. Now, research also suggests the cancer, COVID, all of these at the heart of the disease propagation and why the body responds to these diseases in a certain way. Inflammation is at the core. And these corticosteroids, when prescribed or given to patient, they suppress the immune system. They help control conditions in which immune system also mistakenly attacks its own body cells. But the problem with steroids is the side effect. As we discussed, the side effects with many drugs which are not specific for a disease, when they are given to patient with other similar diseases, they cause a lot of side effects in the body because they're not meant to be used in that way. So the steroids have a lot of side effects: high blood pressure, stomach upset, weight gain, and in many cases, people who are under steroid treatment, and those are usually prescribed temporarily, but people who are under steroid treatments, they develop type 2 diabetes. They kind of, attack the cells in the pancreas. And therefore, these drugs type of chemicals are used very cautiously by the physicians, and physicians who are using them use it, in specific cases where there are no other drugs available. So this is a generic answer, but there are, more specific answer depending on the disease and things that doctors are treating the patient with.
Thank you, Samita. We have additional questions also, many questions that have been asked even before, but we are running short on time. So maybe in the interest of time, what I can do is just ask Leigh and then Samita if they have any sort of closing remarks and thoughts about some of the work that they're doing and the discussion that we had. Leigh, would you like to start?
Sure. So again, I think you guys have heard a lot about today about how these comorbidities maybe increase risk for cardiovascular disease, and how a lot of these processes and mechanisms may be similar. And so I want to point out, we're fortunate at the CVRI to be able to all bring in our areas of expertise. So whether that's metabolism or inflammation, and we're also situated near other investigators within Sinai who bring in expertise in other disease areas. So we're really able to look at these processes not in isolation, but as a whole, and collaborate with many different investigators trying to understand the fundamental mechanisms by which all of these disease processes are related in order so that we may develop new treatment options.
Thank you, Leigh. Samita, do you have any closing comments?
Yes, I share Leigh's sentiment about collaboration, and my lab's goal is to detect diseases in the laboratory much before the symptoms of the disease are known to the patients or to their doctors. We work with sophisticated data scientist teams to analyze volumes of data generated from sequencing, and we compare and recruit hundreds of patients and compare that with healthy patients to correlate what molecule correlates with the disease state, to make sure that we identify a set of microRNAs that harms the heart in all patient samples. And our long-term goal is to work with file patents from our discovery, work with pharma companies to develop diagnostic kits to help detect heart failure in patients. And developing therapeutics takes much longer. And as they say, it takes a village, and it indeed takes a village, starting from VPIs, applying for grants and writing papers, to our team members who really do the hard work to, like at the laboratory level to detect these molecules, to design and analyze the data. So we are so grateful to have this system at CVRI, which not only provides, with world-class scientists, but also world-class facilities that we are able to do this research in collaboration. And I'm so thankful to colleagues like you, Dr. Swirski and Dr. Goedeke. We feel fortunate to work together as a team, and I thank everyone for the attention to our research today.
Thank you, Susmita. So I will just also say just a few words in closing. What you heard today were, just a tiny sliver of in very specific examples of how one morbidity or how one disease can affect cardiovascular disease. So we heard about type 1 and type 2 diabetes, about kidney disease, and about viral and pulmonary infection, and specifically influenza. But there's many, many such connections. And really, we need to understand how these diseases are connected with each other if we are to discover new ways of treating and curing those diseases, because these diseases sort of talk to each other and accelerate each other. Key words that you heard throughout this webinar are inflammation, metabolism, and precision medicine. So we are recognizing that a major system that connects diseases is the immune system. And one of its executive arms, one functional arm of the immune system is inflammation, which is necessary to fight infections and injury, but in abundance can cause harm. And this is what we are seeing when we are looking at how one disease affects another, is that there is an overabundance of inflammation. And likewise, metabolism, it's a system that is really dealing with energy that we consume in food, and how it deals with that energy, how it allocates sugar, how it allocates fat, has a huge consequences on inflammation, and has huge consequences on how these diseases influence one another. And then sort of the last theme, you heard that I think was mentioned a few times, is precision medicine, is that we are recognizing that while some treatments have these very broad effects, and it seems, statins are a great example, certainly the weight lowering drugs like Ozempic are another great example, there are side effects. And it is through research done in labs, through work done at the Cardiovascular Research Institute in collaboration with our clinical colleagues, what we have the opportunity to do is to discover really precise interventions that limit side effects, but that really get to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is when we understand how immune cells, or how general cells, really talk to each other and communicate with each other as they produce the various molecules, metabolites you heard, cytokines or chemokines. Those are other words that describe the functions of the products of immune cells and cells in general, that then can be targeted and drugged and affecting the course of a particular disease. So that leads us to the end of this webinar. We thank you for your attention. I will say that all of the research and ways that innovative ways just discussed are made possible because of the extraordinary power of philanthropy. As scientists, we are supported by grants, but philanthropy is a major contributor to this. And I will also say that the work has only just begun. We need the help to give these leaders and resources to keep going, to keep innovating, and bring those innovations to the clinic. So as you can see here, there is a special QR code, a so-called flow code that is now on the screen. So you can point your smartphone camera, and it will take you to a web page where you can support this work. So we hope that you have enjoyed this webinar. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us this afternoon. We hope to do this again. There are many topics that we would like to speak about. And thank you for your interest in our work to improve heart health. Have a pleasant afternoon.